Since I teach the rest of the year at Perlman, it's kind of nice to be called in as a sub. So I don't know whether I should be delighted or shocked that you didn't ask for my lesson plan. Let me begin with a question. When was the last time you truly listened? Not just heard, but listened to someone in this room, to a passage of Torah, or even to the quiet stirrings within yourself that ask, what is this moment asking of me? I know there are conversations that can light up a room, but in the worst possible way, where anxiety saturates the air as you approach that infamous third rail. Speaking of synagogue, policy disputes, debates over Jewish law when tradition and modern values collide, intermarriage, decline and identity crisis in conservative Judaism. They have the power to draw out hopes and fears in equal measure. It's tempting to retreat behind policies and statistics, but I believe we have a holier path to tread, the path of deep, transformative listening. Parshat Eikev gives us a powerful, layered call. V'hayayim shamoa tishma'u el mitzvotai asher anochi metzaveh etchem hayom la'ahava et Adonai Elohechem. And it shall be, if listening, you shall listen to my commandments, which I am commanding you today, to love the Lord your God, to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. That literal translation, if listening, you shall listen, im shamoa tishma'u, is a highly unusual and a deliberate doubling of the Hebrew verb. It's a phrase that appears here and at the revelation at Sinai. Both call for active listening and response, not passive hearing, and both appear within the context of a relationship with God. Some commentators explain that the first shamoa refers to the receiving of the words, while tishma'u demands that we internalize and act upon what we've heard. True listening requires both mind and heart, intellectual comprehension, but joined with emotional engagement. To listen in this Torah sense means to open ourselves beyond surface understanding and calls for us to grapple honestly with tensions between tradition and modernity, personal meaning and communal obligation, certainty and ambiguity. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs reflected on this phrase as an invitation to continual return and wrestling with Torah's message, echoing the teaching of Pirkei Avot, turn it and turn it again, for everything is in it. The Maharal of Prague teaches that this endless turning reflects the infinite nature of Torah itself. Each generation must discover anew what the text demands of them. Rabbi Schwartzman pointed us and had us study Moses' great summary of what God asks of us. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you but to revere the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and soul? It's Moses' attempt to distill the essence of 613 commandments into something that we can grasp. Centuries later, the prophet Micah attempts something remarkably similar, yet startlingly different. Micah begins with nearly identical language. He has told you, mortals, what is good and what the Lord requires of you. But then Micah's answer diverges from Moses'. Only to do what is right, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Is Micah arguing with Moses? Not at all. Micah is offering us something essential. Moses tells us what God asks of us as Jews, that special covenantal relationship with the divine. But Micah reminds us of what God demands of us as human beings, the foundation that makes authentic Jewish living possible. Here's where Micah's wisdom becomes essential for our anxious moment. When communities panic about demographic decline or about Jewish status or marriage, we often reach for something that Micah sometimes warns against, dangerous steps of an escalating action. Micah rhetorically asks, with what shall I approach God? How shall I show my submission to the Lord who's most high? Shall I give offerings to him? Maybe fine offerings with calves that are just a year old. Would God perhaps be appeased with 1,000 rams, 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I perhaps sacrifice my firstborn to him? The prophet is being sarcastic, but you can see how he develops these dangerous escalations. First, you think you give an offering, but then you've got to give the best of offerings. Maybe 1,000 would be better, then maybe 10,000 rivers of oil, and if that weren't good enough, maybe you make the supreme sacrifice. These are dangerous steps, and at the top is a precipice. In our anxiety about Jewish continuity, we're tempted to reach for solutions, another program, another campaign, another outreach initiative, in the hope that something is going to fix what troubles us. But we may also be tempted to reach for something even more dangerous, the urge to control spiritual outcomes, to manufacture connection rather than trust in authentic encounter. Micah would caution against the idea that more offerings, more actions, more intensity can substitute for the work of the heart and spirit. What's demanded is not an abundance of offerings, but an abundance of compassionate conversations free of judgment. What we need is not quantity of response, but depth of listening. What we need is the courage to trust people's spiritual intelligence, to believe that when they encounter our tradition authentically, on their own terms, in their own time, something sacred will stir. But we are not there yet. And when that anxiety spreads from person to person, from family to family, we get what Dr. Edwin Friedman described in a simple but profound fable. Picture a huge assembly of dominoes meticulously arranged in a long line. One day, something disturbs the chain, and the dominoes begin to fall. One into the next, panic and collapse spreading inexorably. Some dominoes give in immediately, others pretend nothing is happening. A few become so anxious they fall even before their time. Some, in desperation, throw themselves forward in the hope that sacrificial action might halt the cascade. The fever of panic is contagious. Every domino feels the urge to surrender to the tide. But what actually stops such panic is not an elaborate technical solution or a heroic dash of anxiety. It is a single domino deciding with resolute will to stand firm, to break the chain. This domino neither denies the danger nor ignores the real threat, but remains calm, distinct, and steadfast. It disrupts the pattern. Dr. Friedman was describing self-differentiation, the capacity to hold one's ground in the midst of anxiety and emotional turmoil, to listen firmly yet compassionately, to lead without succumbing to fear or pressure. I think this means being secure enough in our own foundation that we can genuinely listen to others' spiritual needs without feeling threatened. It means being present, but not entangled. The Baal Shem Tov similarly taught that when you find yourself in a place of spiritual darkness, do not run. Stand still. Become a vessel for light. Leadership, in how I see it and how I try to guide others, begins with this emotional self-differentiation, the ability to be grounded enough that we don't need others to validate our tradition by conforming to our expectations. This is what Micah offers us, not the perilous stairs that lead to a drop-off, but a different kind of staircase, one that builds a foundation strong enough to hold when the dominoes around us begin to topple. Each step builds on the one before. First, do justice. This is the ground floor of human decency. Living with fairness, honesty, respect towards every person, no matter their story or choices. If all can be said of you is that you're fair, that's no small thing. You've definitely laid essential groundwork. But justice alone is not the fullness of goodness. Second, love kindness. On top of fairness, we place kindness. The Hebrew says, ahavat chesed, love kindness. Don't just practice it, but cherish it. Kindness without justice lacks roots. Justice without kindness becomes sharp and cold. But together, they form the soil where real relationships can grow. Third, walk humbly with your God. This is where it all comes together. We can strive for justice, we can practice kindness, but if we walk with God arrogantly, our humility slips through our fingers. Our focus turns inward, narrow. But Micah calls us higher. Walk with God, yes, but walk humbly. The humble heart says, I believe this, you believe that, and yet I see you as God's beloved. I can act justly toward you. I can be kind toward you. Micah's invitation is not merely to tolerate one another. It's to ground that tolerance in humility before God, and that humility reshapes everything. It frees us to see others not as rivals in faith, but as fellow travelers in God's world. Imagine for a moment that our congregation is like Friedman's line of dominoes. When anxiety strikes over various issues, from demographic decline to whatever, it's easy for panic to leap from one member to another. Some might be prepared to fall at the first hint of insecurity. Others try to run ahead to preempt the crisis. Others might simply be paralyzed. In our time, Jewish life has become largely voluntary. People choose how and to what degree they engage with our traditions. This reality creates real tensions. How do we hold up the covenant's ideals without shutting down conversations or diminishing the personhood of those wrestling with complex paths? Rashbam reminds us that God's covenant with Israel was never meant to be coercive, but transformative. It calls us into relationship, but not into submission. Today's rabbinic authority has shifted from position to relationship. People no longer simply ask, what should we do? But instead ask, what does this mean for us? How do we take hold of the compass for our own spiritual journey? Developing and strengthening the bonds that link us to Jewish wisdom means standing upright with purpose. It means refusing to be toppled by collective anxiety, trusting that our tradition is profound enough to speak for itself when people encounter it authentically. The real work is not in managing outcomes through policy, but in creating space for real engagement. It means trusting people enough to let them encounter our tradition on their own terms, confident that what is truly sacred will resonate in its own time and way. When families come to me wrestling with questions of Jewish identity, they don't need statistical arguments or escalating religious demands. They need someone who can listen without defensiveness and allow them to find their own meanings, their own sacred intersections. When we're anxious about spiritual outcomes, we might try to control the process. But spiritual connection can't be manufactured or coerced. My role involves creating sacred space for those questions, helping people take responsibility for their engagement with Torah and tradition. It's a process of discovery, not imposition. Only when people feel truly seen and met with openness and humble respect will they invite us into their deepest spiritual questions. This is an approach that requires deep trust. Trust in the Torah's wisdom to speak across generations. Trust in people's spiritual intelligence to recognize truth when they encounter it. This balance between richly held boundaries and openness to personal meaning is the hallmark of a mature Jewish perspective. It respects the beauty and distinctiveness of our covenant without ignoring the complex realities that families face today. It shores up the foundation of our humanity rather than climbing a dangerous staircase of ever-escalating lists of actions. Sometimes the tension between inclusion and particularity feels acute. But particularity itself is at the core of what we do as Jews. Our specific narratives, rituals, and symbols have power precisely because they are distinctly ours. But just as other traditions serve their communities, we do so through our distinctive wisdom as they do theirs. I try to echo the teachings of Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, a generational great who taught that the rigid walls that once defined Jewish life must become permeable membranes, firm enough to maintain their distinctiveness, flexible enough to allow for authentic encounter. These membranes allow people to encounter tradition genuinely rather than feeling pressured to fit predetermined molds. When we're secure in our own spiritual foundation, we can afford to be open to the journeys of others. This is the discipline of spirit that our moment demands. As I help my young students, but also their teachers and their families, I don't impose communal expectations. Instead, I help them to articulate their own vision for Jewish life. What kind of home do they want to build? What traditions feel meaningful to them? How do they want to embody kindness and a humble relationship with the divine? This becomes a conversation about their own relationship with Jewish meaning. This approach honors both that person's spiritual autonomy and the depth of our tradition. From it, something sacred emerges. Just as we aspire to listen to God's voice in the midst of noisy chaos, so do our moments of anxiety invite us to ground ourselves in a deep listening that becomes the bridge between worlds, between the sacred and the searching. But here's what I want to leave you with today. This isn't just about surviving our anxious moment or managing our communal tensions. This is about something much more profound. We live in a time when the world desperately needs communities that know how to do justice without coldness and walk with the divine without arrogance. The world needs people who can stand firm, not because they're rigid, but because they're rooted in something deeper than fears. The world needs communities confident enough in their own spiritual wisdom that they can create space for others and their own authentic encounter. When you walk out of here today, you're going to encounter the falling dominoes in family conversations about identity, in workplace discussions about fairness and values, in neighborhood struggles about difference and belonging. The question isn't whether you'll face these moments. The question is, will you be the domino that decides that the panic stops? This is your invitation to be that person, not the person who has all the answers, but the person grounded enough to create space for others, not the person who never feels anxiety, but the person who doesn't let anxiety make the decisions. The person confident enough in what our tradition offers, who can let others encounter it freely, trusting that genuine spiritual seeking will lead where it needs to go. Our Torah teaches us to listen, and to listen a second time. Moses' promise from our parashah is loud and clear. If you truly listen, you will live and thrive. But thriving is not just about our own survival. It's about becoming the kind of people who can interrupt the cycles that we typically go through, who can model what it looks like to walk humbly with the divine. It's about becoming communities where people encounter the sacred on their own terms. The dominoes are falling around us. Yes, the anxiety is real. The challenge to Jewish continuity and community are genuine. But you, trained by Torah's call for deep listening, you have the power to stand firm, to create space for what will emerge. The greatest compliment to our tradition is when people choose it from a place of genuine spiritual seeking. That's not just hope. That's the sacred work of this moment. And it begins with each of us deciding. The real transformation starts now. Shabbat Shalom.